There's nothing like the mournful wail of the slide guitar to bring one of the great stories of rock and roll myths and legends to light. And that is the story of Robert Johnson, the premier bluesman from the Mississippi Delta, who not only recorded songs that changed music forever, but was an influence to Eric Clapton, to Jimmy Page, and Keith Richards. So the modern power of Robert Johnson lives on. But what do we know about this man? We know he was born somewhere around Clarksdale, Mississippi. We know that he wasn't a very good musician in his early life. And matter of fact, his favorite instrument was the harmonica. But he tried to sit in with all the great bluesmen like Son House, Charlie Patton. And these men, when they heard him play, he was so poor that they decided to avoid him, so they wouldn't let him sit in any longer. Well, that is, until he disappeared. Because Robert Johnson was gone for 6 months, and when he returned, he was the greatest guitarist in the Mississippi Delta. When Son House heard him play, he turned to the other bluesmen and he said, "You know, he sold his soul to play like that." Johnson had claimed that he'd been taught to play the guitar by the devil. And this devil's name was Ike Zinnemann from Alabama. Ike Zinnemann doesn't sound like a classic bluesman. He's not Blind Lemon Jefferson, but the name is so odd, and the story that he had taught Robert Johnson to play the guitar in graveyards at night added to the myth of the supernatural soliciting theme. When Johnson played the roadhouses, everyone knew the stories. They'd heard Son House say that he had sold his soul to play like that, so they came to see him. And if you saw Robert Johnson, when he bent over his guitar and he would look up at the audience, he had a cataract in one of his eyes. And when the light hit it in just the right way, it would glow. And people were convinced that that was the evil eye. Other times when Johnson played, he would turn his back to the crowd, and people were convinced that he had something to hide. Perhaps it was the supernatural tuning the devil had placed on his guitar at the crossroads. But probably in more actuality, it was the idea that he didn't want other guitar players to steal his licks. You know, Eddie Van Halen did the same thing with his two-hand technique on the first Van Halen album. He turned his back to the audience so he could keep his technique secret as long as he could. So did Johnson. The tragic part of Robert Johnson's life, a life filled with tragedy. He had been married twice. His first wife died in childbirth, and he lost his child also. His second wife, Callie Craft, was driven to some form of insanity, which fit into the story that sometimes others have to pay the devil's price. When Johnson carried on through the roadhouses with 2 pen names because he was convinced that if a murder was committed, they couldn't pin it on him. People claim to say that his appearance changed. We know today that there's 2 photographs of Robert Johnson. Some historians say that neither of those photographs are Johnson. A man without a face, but with a distinctive sound with the slide guitar. One night, Robert Johnson was playing a roadhouse at Three Forks, and during the performance, he was given a bottle of whiskey. Johnson had a peculiar habit of picking out certain women in each town that would be his companions for the evening. Unfortunately for Robert Johnson, he chose a woman whose husband was the owner of the juke joint. The bottle of whiskey had been tampered with, and it was filled with strychnine. Warned by Sonny Boy Williamson to never drink from an open bottle, it was bad news that Robert Johnson disregarded his friend's advice. He drank from the bottle. As he performed, he became weaker. He became sicker. He was carried from the roadhouse to a nearby house. And there, after closely being guarded by several of his friends, Johnson fell on his hands and knees and, according to the legend, howled like a dog right before his death. To make matters even stranger, there are 3 grave locations for Robert Johnson in Mississippi. The last one only being found 4 years ago, where a woman says that her father buried a bluesman whose name was Robert Johnson. Perhaps that might be adequate, because in one of Robert Johnson's songs, he mentioned to bury him by the old roadside so that his old evil spirit could catch a Greyhound bus and ride. This is Gary Patterson. Thanks for walking with me on the dark side. You know, you may think some of these stories are fact and some are fiction, but one thing for certain, you'll never listen to your music exactly the same way again.
Thank you.